It all started when I decided to take a solo trip to Scotland. I had always been fascinated by its rich history and stunning landscapes. Edinburgh, with its Gothic architecture and winding streets, seemed like the perfect destination. I booked a week at the Blackwood Hotel, a historic establishment nestled in the heart of the city. The photos online showed a beautiful old building with ivy-covered walls and cozy, warmly lit rooms. It seemed like the ideal place to unwind after days of exploring. When I arrived, I was immediately struck by the hotel's eerie atmosphere. The facade was even more imposing in person, with its tall, narrow windows and dark stone walls. The receptionist, an older man with a gravelly voice, handed me an old-fashioned key and directed me to my room on the 4th floor. The elevator was out of order, so I had to take the stairs, which were dimly lit and creaked with every step. My room was at the end of a long corridor. The wallpaper was peeling, and there was a musty smell in the air. As I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I felt an inexplicable chill. The room itself was small but adequately furnished. A large antique wardrobe stood against one wall, and a heavy wooden bed frame dominated the space. A single window looked out onto the street below. That first night, I struggled to sleep. Every little sound seemed amplified in the silence of the night. The old building groaned and creaked as if settling into itself. I tossed and turned, trying to get comfortable, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. The room was pitch black, but I could hear a faint, scraping noise coming from the direction of the wardrobe. I lay still, straining my ears. The sound stopped, then started again, like something was being dragged across the floor. My heart pounded in my chest, and I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight. The beam of light from my phone cut through the darkness, illuminating the wardrobe. The door was slightly ajar. I knew I had closed it before going to bed. Gathering all my courage, I got up and walked over to it. I hesitated for a moment, then yanked the door open. The wardrobe was empty except for a few old hangers swaying gently. There was nothing inside that could have made the noise. I closed it firmly and went back to bed, telling myself it was just my imagination. The next day, I tried to put the incident out of my mind. I spent the day exploring Edinburgh, visiting the castle and strolling down the Royal Mile. By the time I returned to the hotel, I was exhausted and hoped for a good night's sleep. However, that night was even worse. I woke up again to the sound of scratching, this time louder and more insistent. It was coming from behind the wardrobe. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I grabbed my phone and approached the wardrobe again. As I neared it, the scratching stopped abruptly. I opened the door and found nothing. Frustrated and unnerved, I decided to push the wardrobe away from the wall to see if there was something behind it. To my horror, there was a small, hidden door behind the wardrobe, just big enough for someone to crawl through. It was old and covered in cobwebs, and there was a rusty padlock keeping it shut. My mind raced with possibilities. Why was there a hidden door in my room? And what was on the other side? I knew I had to find out. I went down to the reception to ask about the door, but the receptionist was nowhere to be found. The lobby was empty, and a sense of unease settled over me. I decided to wait until morning to confront the staff about it. That night, I barely slept. Every noise seemed magnified in the darkness. The scratching didn't return, but the presence of the hidden door gnawed at me. When morning finally came, I went straight to the reception. A different receptionist. A young woman with a kind smile was on duty. I explained what I had found in my room, and her expression changed from friendly to concerned. she apologized profusely and promised to send someone up to investigate. Relieved, I spent the day out again, trying to enjoy my vacation despite the unsettling discovery. When I returned in the evening, the receptionist assured me that they had checked the room and found nothing unusual. The hidden door was part of the old building's original structure, she explained, and had been sealed off for years. She assured me there was no cause for concern. I tried to take her words to heart, but that night the scratching returned louder than ever. It seemed to be coming from inside the walls, moving around my room. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, listening as it traveled from one side of the room to the other. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I demanded to be moved to a different room. The hotel staff was understanding and relocated me to a room on the second floor. This room was brighter and more modern, and I hoped it would bring an end to the disturbances. For a couple of nights, everything was quiet. I started to relax, thinking the ordeal was over. But then, on my last night at the hotel, it happened again. This time, the scratching was accompanied by faint whispers, just on the edge of hearing. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I sat up in bed, clutching my phone, the light casting long shadows in the corners of the room. The whispers grew louder, and the scratching seemed to be coming from beneath the floorboards. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my bags in a hurry and went down to the lobby, determined to check out immediately. The night receptionist looked at me with a mixture of confusion and concern as I explained that I had to leave. I didn't care about the refund, I just wanted to get out of there. She processed my checkout quickly, and I found myself standing on the street outside, feeling a strange mix of relief and lingering fear. I spent the rest of the night at a 24-hour cafe, too afraid to book another hotel room. As soon as it was light, I caught the first train out of Edinburgh, leaving the Blackwood Hotel and its eerie mysteries behind. Looking back, I still don't know what caused the disturbances in my room. Maybe it was just an old building settling, or perhaps there was some rational explanation for the noises and the hidden door. But one thing is certain. I'll never forget my stay at the Blackwood Hotel. It was a reminder that sometimes the scariest experiences aren't about ghosts or supernatural forces, but the unexplained and the unknown that can lurk in the most unexpected places. Last year, I went on a trip to Chicago for a work conference. Since I was on a budget, I booked a room at a small, somewhat old hotel on the outskirts of downtown. The hotel, the Windy City Inn, had decent reviews and looked all right in pictures, so I figured it would be fine for the few nights I was staying there. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the city. The cab dropped me off at the entrance, and I immediately noticed the hotel had a certain charm to it. It was an old brick building, probably from the early 1900s, with ivy creeping up one side. Inside, the lobby was quaint, with dark wood paneling and old-fashioned furniture. The receptionist, a middle-aged man with a thick mustache and tired eyes, checked me in and handed over the key to room 312. I took the rickety elevator up to the third floor. The hallways were narrow and dimly lit with old carpeting that had seen better days. I found my room at the end of the hall, and when I opened the door, it creaked loudly. The room was small and simple, with a single bed, a nightstand, and a small dresser. The window overlooked a back alley, and the paint on the walls was chipped and peeling in places. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but it seemed clean enough. After unpacking, I decided to explore the city a bit before it got too late. I grabbed a quick dinner at a nearby diner and wandered around downtown, taking in the sights and sounds of Chicago. By the time I got back to the hotel, it was almost 11 p.m. The lobby was empty, and the whole place seemed eerily quiet. I took the elevator back up to my room, the old cables clanking and groaning with each floor. Once in my room, I locked the door and got ready for bed. I had an early start the next day, so I wanted to get as much rest as possible. I crawled into bed, turned off the lights, and lay there trying to fall asleep. But it wasn't easy. The room felt unusually cold, and the bed was far from comfortable. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours, unable to get comfortable. At some point I must have drifted off, but I was awakened suddenly by a loud thud. My eyes snapped open, and I lay there heart pounding, straining to hear any other sounds. The room was pitch black, and I could barely make out the shapes of the furniture. I listened intently, but everything was silent again. I figured it was just the old building settling or something outside in the alley and tried to go back to sleep. Just as I was dozing off again, I heard another noise, this time a soft shuffling sound, like footsteps. I sat up in bed, my pulse racing. The sound seemed to be coming from just outside my door. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand. It was a little past 2 a.m. I got out of bed and crept to the door, pressing my ear against it. The hallway was silent. Feeling a bit foolish, I decided to check it out. I unlocked the door and opened it a crack, peeking into the dimly lit hallway. It was empty. I stepped out, leaving the door ajar, and walked down the hall a bit. But there was no one there. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard a faint clicking sound behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing. The hallway was empty, and the only sound was the old radiator hissing softly. I went back to my room, feeling a bit uneasy. I locked the door again and climbed back into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. I told myself it was just my imagination, and that old buildings make strange noises all the time. But sleep wouldn't come. I lay there, wide awake, listening for any other sounds. Around 4 a.m., I finally drifted off, only to be awakened again by a loud bang like something heavy had fallen. I shot out of bed and turned on the light. The room was empty, but my suitcase, which I had left on the dresser, was now on the floor, clothes scattered everywhere. I hadn't heard anyone enter the room, and the door was still locked from the inside. My heart was racing, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I quickly gathered up my clothes and shoved them back into the suitcase, glancing nervously around the room. I had no idea what was going on, but I felt an overwhelming urge to get out of there. I checked the time. It was almost 5 a.m. I decided I would leave the hotel first thing in the morning and find somewhere else to stay. I sat on the edge of the bed, too scared to lie back down. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the window, I felt a small sense of relief. I packed up the rest of my things, got dressed, and waited for the reception to open so I could check out. When I finally went downstairs, the receptionist from the night before was there again. He gave me a tired smile as I handed over my key and asked to check out early. He didn't seem surprised, and for a moment I wondered if other guests had experienced similar things. As I walked out of the hotel and into the early morning light, I felt a huge sense of relief wash over me. I ended up finding another hotel closer to the conference center and had no further issues for the rest of my trip. But the experience at the Windy City Inn stayed with me. To this day, I have no explanation for the strange noises and the suitcase incident. I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe it was a combination of the old building and my own overactive imagination, but it still gives me chills whenever I think about it. After I got back home, I looked up some reviews of the Windy City Inn to see if anyone else had mentioned similar experiences. Most of the reviews were pretty mundane, but I did find a few that mentioned strange noises and an overall creepy vibe. One reviewer even mentioned having their belongings moved around during the night, just like what happened to me. It made me feel a bit better knowing I wasn't the only one, but it also made the whole thing even creepier. I haven't been back to Chicago since then, but if I ever do go back, I know I'll be avoiding that hotel. The experience was unsettling enough to make me much more cautious about where I stay when I travel. It's funny how a few nights in a strange old hotel can leave such a lasting impression. Every time I book a hotel now, I make sure to read the reviews thoroughly and always choose somewhere that feels safe and comfortable. I recently took a solo trip to Colorado to unwind and recharge. Nestled in the Rockies, Hollow Creek Inn seemed like the perfect retreat. The photos online showed a picturesque lodge surrounded by towering pines and a crystal-clear creek. It looked like a serene escape from my hectic life in the city. When I arrived, the inn was even more charming than I had imagined. The log cabin architecture and rustic decor gave it a cozy, welcoming vibe. The receptionist, an elderly woman named Mabel, greeted me warmly and handed me an old-fashioned key to room 7. She mentioned that the inn had a rich history dating back to the early 1900s, which added to its allure. My room was quaint and comfortable, with a large bed, a wooden dresser, and a window overlooking the creek. I unpacked my bags and decided to explore the area. The fresh mountain air and the sound of the rushing creek were incredibly soothing. I spent the afternoon hiking nearby trails, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. That night, after a hearty dinner at a local diner, I returned to the inn and settled into bed. The quiet of the mountains was a stark contrast to the constant noise of the city. I fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from the day's activities. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with a start. The room was pitch black, but I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. At first, I thought it might be a tree branch hitting the window, but the noise was too steady and deliberate. I lay still, straining to hear where it was coming from. It seemed to be coming from the wall behind the bed. I turned on the bedside lamp and got up to investigate. The tapping stopped as soon as I moved. I checked the window and the walls but found nothing unusual. Convincing myself it was just the old building settling, I went back to bed. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning I mentioned the noise to Mabel at breakfast. She gave me a knowing smile and said that Hollow Creek Inn was known for its quirks. She assured me that the building was old and tended to make strange noises. Her explanation was plausible, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. That day, I decided to drive to a nearby town to explore and take my mind off the previous night's disturbance. The quaint shops and friendly locals were a pleasant distraction. I returned to the inn in the late afternoon, feeling more at ease. I spent the evening reading by the fire in the lounge, enjoying the peace and quiet. That night, as I lay in bed, the tapping sound returned. This time it was louder and more insistent. My heart raced as I listened to the steady rhythm. I decided to record the noise on my phone to prove to myself that it was real. The tapping continued for several minutes before stopping abruptly. I played back the recording, and there it was, an eerie, repetitive tapping. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I searched the room thoroughly. As I moved the dresser, I noticed a small hidden door in the wall. It was barely noticeable, painted the same color as the wall. My curiosity piqued. I tried the handle, but it was locked. I decided to ask Mabel about it in the morning. At breakfast, I brought up the hidden door to Mabel. Her expression changed from friendly to concerned. She hesitated before explaining that the door led to an old storage space that hadn't been used in years. She assured me it was nothing to worry about, but I could tell she was hiding something. That day, I couldn't focus on anything else. The hidden door and the strange noises occupied my thoughts. I decided to cut my trip short and check out the next day. I packed my bags that evening, determined to get some answers before I left. That night, the tapping started again, louder than ever. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I got up, moved the dresser, and stared at the hidden door. Summoning all my courage, I decided to find a way to open it. I searched the room for anything that might help and found an old rusty key in the dresser drawer. It looked like it might fit the lock. With trembling hands, I inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a creak and the door swung open. A cold draft hit me, sending chills down my spine. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, revealing a narrow, dusty passageway. The walls were lined with old, decaying shelves, and the air smelled musty. I stepped into the passageway, my heart pounding. The tapping sound grew louder as I moved deeper into the corridor. At the end of the passageway, I found another door, slightly ajar. Pushing it open, I entered a small room filled with old furniture covered in white sheets. In the center of the room was a large wooden trunk. The tapping sound seemed to be coming from inside. My hands shook as I approached the trunk and lifted the lid. Inside, I found an old phonograph, the needle stuck on a record, creating the repetitive tapping noise. Relieved, I turned off the phonograph and let out a sigh. But my relief was short-lived. As I turned to leave, I noticed something glinting in the corner of the room. I walked over and found a small metal box. Inside were photographs and letters, all dated from the early 1900s. The photographs showed the inn and its original owner, a man named Samuel Holloway. The letters were addressed to Samuel from a woman named Eliza, detailing their secret relationship and plans to run away together. One letter in particular caught my attention. It was dated the day before Samuel's disappearance and spoke of their plan to meet in the storage room and leave that night. My mind raced as I pieced together the story. Samuel had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and Eliza was never heard from again. As I stood there reading the letters, I felt a cold breeze and heard a soft whisper behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. The room felt colder, and an overwhelming sense of sadness washed over me. I hurried back through the passageway, locking the hidden door behind me. I left Hollow Creek Inn the next morning, feeling a mix of fear and sorrow. Mabel didn't ask any questions, but I could see the concern in her eyes. I didn't mention the hidden room or the letters, unsure of what to say. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about Samuel and Eliza. I contacted the local historical society and shared my findings. They were fascinated and promised to look into the story. Weeks later, I received an email from them confirming that Samuel Holloway and Eliza had indeed disappeared under mysterious circumstances and that their story had become a local legend. To this day, I can't explain what I experienced at Hollow Creek Inn. The tapping sound, the hidden door, the letters. They all point to a tragic love story that ended in mystery. I often wonder if Samuel and Eliza ever found peace, or if their spirits are still trapped in that old inn, longing to be reunited. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.